3 years after the invasion began, the numbers are undeniable. 910,000 casualties, thousands of tanks destroyed, and an army aging faster than it can replace its ranks. Ukraine, once at a disadvantage, now dictates the pace of the conflict with swarms of drones that have replaced entire infantry divisions. Meanwhile, the Kremlin keeps repeating the same rhetoric of inevitable victory. But when the numbers are this brutal, one question becomes impossible to ignore. How long can a country sustain a war it has already lost? To understand the current collapse, we need to go back to where it all began. February of 2022. At that moment, the military balance between Russia and Ukraine was a canyon. Russia entered the war with around 900,000 active soldiers, plus 2 million reservists ready to be called up. Ukraine, on the other hand, had fewer than 200,000 active troops and just over 900,000 reservists, many of them without recent training or proper equipment. In practice, Moscow started the conflict with a numerical advantage of almost 5-1, a gap that on paper seemed impossible to overcome. On the battlefield, the contrast in heavy equipment was brutal. Russia had more than 3,400 main battle tanks, including hundreds of T-80 and T-90 models, modern machines with reactive armor and computerized targeting systems. Ukraine, meanwhile, had about 990 tanks, not all of them operational. Many were Soviet-era T-64s, designed back in the 1970s. When it came to armored vehicles, the gap was even wider, 30,000 Russian units against roughly 12,000 Ukrainian ones. In artillery, Russian dominance was absolute, 14,000 systems compared to only 3,000 on the Ukrainian side. And in multiple rocket launchers, the ratio was devastating, 3,500 to 600. It was the classic Soviet-style mass warfare being revived by Moscow, and no one doubted that Russia would crush Ukraine within weeks. While Ukraine tried to modernize its T-64s into the Bulat version, adding extra armor and locally made thermal sights, the results were still limited. Those tanks remained inferior to the Russian T-90s, which combined night vision sensors, stabilized fire control systems, and even active protection against anti-tank missiles. It was the difference between an army built to parade and one ready to fight. In the air and at sea, the situation was even darker. The Russian Air Force had 1,500 combat aircraft and 500 attack helicopters, enough air power to dominate the skies over Eastern Europe. Ukraine had only 116 aircraft and 55 helicopters, many of them outdated, lacking modern radar and guided weapons. And in the Black Sea, the Russian Navy imposed immediate supremacy. Ukraine's main frigate, surrounded and with no chance of resistance, was scuttled by its own crew to keep it from falling into enemy hands. The message was clear. At the start of the invasion, Russia didn't just have the upper hand, it looked unbeatable. But history would soon prove that numbers and technology alone don't win wars. All that supposed undeniable superiority lasted only 3 days. Putin's plan was straightforward and brutally ambitious. The idea was to decapitate the Ukrainian government before the country even had time to react. To do that, Russia's elite troops, mainly airborne units from the National Guard and Spetsnaz special forces, would be deployed to seize Hostomel Airport, right at the gates of Kyiv. From there, helicopters and transport planes would bring in reinforcements, armored vehicles, and supplies. The objective was to capture the capital within 72 hours, arrest or eliminate President Volodymyr Zelensky, and install a puppet government, ending the war before it could truly begin. But the operation failed right out of the gate. US intelligence had warned Kyiv about the planned days in advance, giving the Ukrainians time to prepare defenses around the capital. When Russian helicopters appeared on the horizon, anti-air batteries and artillery were already in position. And the final blow came from the Ukrainians themselves. They bombed Hostomel Airport, destroying their own runway to prevent Russian planes from landing. Without reinforcements, the elite troops were left isolated and were slaughtered on the outskirts of Kyiv. The failure of that plan turned what was supposed to be a special operation, lasting only weeks, into a war of attrition that has now dragged on for years. From that moment on, Russia stopped fighting for victory and started fighting for survival. The Russian army, which believed it would end the conflict in a matter of weeks, has been caught in a grinder of steel and human flesh that hasn't stopped since. In the first 6 months of the war, estimates from the Pentagon and independent analysts already pointed to 80,000 Russian casualties, dead and wounded, the equivalent of twice the total Soviet losses in 10 years of war in Afghanistan. But the number only kept growing. By March of 2023, casualties had already surpassed 200,000. The following year, with the offensives in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, that number nearly doubled. And now, in October of 2025, the total estimated number has reached 910,000 Russian soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Those are numbers no special operation narrative can hide. For comparison, the Soviet Union lost 15,000 men in Afghanistan. Today, Russia loses more than that in a single month of war. But the human losses are only part of the story. The material cost is equally devastating. According to open-source intelligence platforms like Oryx and Warspotting, Russia has already lost more than 10,500 tanks, almost 22,000 armored vehicles, around 25,000 artillery and mortar systems, over 1,000 multiple rocket launchers, and hundreds of combat helicopters and aircraft. These aren't abstract figures, they're entire columns of burned-out armor, T-72s and T-90s reduced to blackened wrecks along Ukraine's roads. In satellite images, battlefields look like metallic graveyards, where every destroyed vehicle tells the story of a failed attack, a poorly planned command, an offensive that never should have happened. And much of that destruction didn't come from large missiles or airstrikes, it came from Ukrainian drones. Ukraine turned the war into a technological laboratory. In 2022, drones were merely reconnaissance tools. By 2025, they had become accessible, lethal precision weapons. FPV drones cost as little as $300, yet carry anti-tank grenades or shaped charges capable of destroying vehicles worth millions. According to recent assessments, between 60 and 80% of all Russian equipment losses were caused by drones. They didn't just make up for Ukraine's numerical disadvantage, they completely redefined the concept of modern warfare. Each attack is streamed in real time, with operators controlling drones from miles away, adjusting their routes and strikes with pinpoint accuracy. And while Russia spends millions to build a T-90 tank, Ukraine destroys it with a handmade drone and a GoPro camera. With such massive losses, the Kremlin had to find a way to keep its front lines supplied, but not with experienced soldiers. Starting in 2023 came partial mobilizations, forced conscriptions in poor regions, and the growing use of prisoners and mercenaries. Men with no training, no clear command, and often no idea why they were even fighting. Videos from Bakhmut and Krinky show groups of Russian recruits sent in frontal assaults with little cover and outdated gear. Russia, which began the war as the world's second-largest military power, now fights with the remnants of its battalions and empty promises of reinforcements. Every victory costs more lives, more armor, and more credibility. And with every body brought back home, the question grows louder inside Russia itself, the one the Kremlin has tried to avoid since day one. How much longer can they keep pretending this is victory? While the numbers on the front keep rising, another kind of loss is eating away at Russia from within. Since the start of the invasion, more than 1 million Russians have left the country. These aren't ordinary deserters, they're highly qualified professionals, engineers, scientists, IT specialists, young entrepreneurs. It was Russia's brainpower that was leaving, and with them, they took something Moscow can't replace with decrees: talent, innovation, and the future itself. The result is an economy that looks alive on paper, but is dying from the inside. Take unemployment, for example, officially just 2.4%, the lowest in modern Russian history. But that number isn't a sign of prosperity, it's a symptom of a critical labor shortage. Thousands of companies now compete for basic workers, while defense factories run 3 shifts a day, absorbing what's left of the civilian workforce. It's a wartime economy, and there's nothing healthy about it. The budget tells the same story. In 2025, 40% of all Russian public spending goes to defense. That's more than 6.3% of the country's GDP, the highest share since the Soviet era. Meanwhile, sectors like healthcare, education, and pensions are being drained to feed the military machine. Hospitals are closing in rural regions, retirements are losing purchasing power, and food inflation has passed 15% in several areas of the interior. Russia is literally trading its people's well-being for the survival of a collapsing army. And even that effort is being propped up by an economy that's increasingly isolated. Western sanctions have cut Russia off from electronic components, financial systems, and European markets. Moscow has been forced to seek new partners: China, India, and Iran. But these nations deal strictly on their own terms. China buys Russian oil at discounts of up to 30%, India pays in local currencies, and Iran trades industrial goods for energy. The Kremlin still exports, but earns far less, and depends on partners who don't share its vision of greatness, only short-term self-interest. And as the money evaporates, the population is disappearing too. Russia was already facing a deep demographic crisis, with one of the lowest fertility rates in Europe. Now it has lost hundreds of thousands of young men on the battlefield, and more than 1 million have emigrated since 2022. They are workers, parents, sons, and they're not coming back. Even if the war ended tomorrow, it would take decades for Russia to recover from this human loss. Because the true cost of this war isn't just in the ruins of burned-out tanks. It's in the emptiness it left inside the country itself, in schools without students, factories without engineers, and cities growing old with no future. 3 years after the invasion began, the outcome is impossible to ignore. Russia has lost nearly 1 million soldiers, more than 10,000 tanks, and plunged into an unprecedented demographic crisis. Meanwhile, its economy has turned into a war machine, consuming what remains of its future to sustain a conflict with no way out. Factories run non-stop, but store shelves are emptying. The numbers may look impressive, but inside, the country is running dry. Even if the Kremlin still manages to capture a few more cities, the truth is, this isn't victory. It's a slow, bleeding defeat. Russia may advance on maps, but it's falling decades behind in population, technology, and global influence. The price being paid is already greater than any territory could ever justify. And that's the essence of collapse: winning battles, while losing the country itself. Now the question that remains is simple, and perhaps the most dangerous of all. Can Russia survive as the nation it once was? Let me know what you think in the comments. Now, the collapse isn't just happening inside Russia's borders, it's reached the battlefield itself. The last major summer offensive, which was supposed to turn the tide of the war, ended in ruins, with losses so massive that even the Kremlin can no longer hide them. If you want to understand how Russia got to this point, and what's left of the army that once promised to conquer Europe, click the card on your screen and watch the full analysis now.